We are now less than a month and a half away until the start of the 2020 NHL playoffs. Jace Mackey chats with Evan Kenny on how the Canadian clubs could do.
Joining me today is Evan Kenny. We're going to be talking a little bit of sports, and the big news in the sports world right now is a return of the NHL playoffs. Now, Evan, there's a handful of Canadian teams that are going to be taking part. So can you just talk a bit about how this is going to affect Canadian hockey?
Yeah, this is awesome for Canadian hockey. It's been a long time since a Canadian team has won the Stanley Cup. It goes all the way back to the Canadians back in the 90s. So for young players growing up, it's great to be able to watch, their team go into the playoffs, and it might get them more excited to keep playing. Like I said, this is the most Canadian teams in the playoffs since 2017. Back in 2017, the Ottawa Senators were still good and making the playoffs. There was five Canadian teams in total versus six this year. So yes, I think this is very good for Canadian hockey, and I think only benefits can come when it comes to a hockey perspective out of this.
So is there a Canadian team that you think is going to surprise people the most?
Yeah, there's a handful of them. I mean, you kind of obviously expect Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto. They're the three highest ranked Canadian teams. But I do think Toronto could surprise some teams. They've always struggled, especially when playing the Boston Bruins in the playoffs. But they're a young team. They're a fast team. And they have Frederik Andersen in their net. So when you combine all three of those, especially in a short time span, when most of the players are cold, first time on the ice in a while, I think they could find success very quickly. Another team that I think it could be up in the air with, but could surprise some teams, is the Winnipeg Jets. Now, their D-core is really hurting, especially after the loss of Tyler Myers and Dustin Byfuglien during free agency and whatnot last season. So they aren't quite as experienced as previous years, and they're not as high of ranked of a team as previous years. But I think their combination of size, skill, and goaltending, again, could surprise some teams. And then finally, for Canadian teams, I think the Vancouver Canucks will be the biggest shock. It's tough to see which way they're going. They play the Minnesota Wild in the first round, which I think they can handle, especially with their goalie, Jacob Markstrom. He posted a .918 save percentage, which is just about as good as Connor Hellebuck, who, very well could win the Vezina this year, and is better than Andrei Vasilevsky, who won the Vezina last season. So I think the Vancouver Canucks could surprise some teams, but it's tough to see how far they'll go.
And just finally, what do you predict will be the end result for each team?
Yeah, it's tough to really say. Like I said, bounces go each way. Playoffs is a very tough thing. It's a different beast than the regular season. So some teams that might have done super well in the regular season could be slumping here. For the Canadian teams, I have the Montreal Canadiens losing in 5 to Pittsburgh. I know that's a little more games than a lot of people could think, but with Shea Weber and Carey Price on your back end, I think anything is possible, and especially in these short series, losing 3 games to 2 is very realistic for Montreal. I have Toronto winning in 5 versus Columbus for their series. We saw Columbus last year stir up the playoffs, knocking off the number 1 seed Tampa Bay Lightning, and I think they'll give Toronto similar troubles as Toronto and Tampa are similar teams. John Tortorella, head coach of the Columbus Blue Jackets, likes a tight team, so you know that they're going to be positionally sound. It's more a matter of will Columbus have the legs under them. Toronto winning in 5 there. Winnipeg and Calgary are facing each other in the first round. This will be, I think, the closest matchup, at least on the west side. Winnipeg, like I mentioned earlier, if they get the right bounces, things could go their way. But Calgary did finish higher, and I do like Calgary's defense led by Mark Giordano much more. I have Calgary in 4 games, but that one's really a toss-up. Vancouver, I have winning in 3 games versus Minnesota. Minnesota just lost their best player, Jason Zucker, in a trade to Pittsburgh at the end of the season, and it didn't look like Minnesota was going to make the playoffs whatsoever. So it was probably the right move before COVID hit. Now, after that loss, I think Vancouver will handle Minnesota quite easily. And then finally, Edmonton, the hosts. I have Edmonton winning in 4 versus Chicago. Chicago does have Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane, but I don't think they're deep enough to hold off McDavid and Draisaitl for an entire series.
Well, thanks for taking some time to talk with me today, Evan. It's going to be interesting to see how it goes because, of course, once you play the games, you don't know what's going to happen. So thanks for taking some time to talk to me today, Evan.
Thanks, Jace.